Well, good morning, beautiful people. So good to be here this morning. I want to start off with a text from the book of Revelation, and we find our man, John the Apostle, on the Isle of Patmos on the Lord's Day in the Spirit. And when he's there, a voice speaks to him, and he turns to see the voice that speaks to him, and this is who he meets. It says in these verses, I saw one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot and girt about the chest with a golden band, and his head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. His feet were like unto fine brass, as if it burned in a furnace, and his voice was as the sound of a multitude. And in his right hand he had 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his countenance was like the sun shining in all its strength. And when I saw this Jesus, I fell down at his feet as a dead man with his face in the dirt. And then he reached out his right hand and he touched me, and he said, do not be afraid, for I am the first and the last. I am he who lives and was dead, and behold, I live forevermore. Well, welcome to this series. It's my pleasure and privilege to kick off this series called Unbelievable, where we're going to explore some of the big questions around the Christmas story. And today, I'm going to look at one of the most fundamental questions you and I could actually ask ourselves. And everything's hanging on this, folks. Your Christmas ham, your trifle, your presents are all hanging on the answer to the question I am going to give today. So fingers crossed. Some of you should be praying. Some of you are nervous. What could be the answer to this question? Because the question is, was Jesus even a real person? Was Jesus even a real person? I think you can see there's a lot hanging on this, ladies and gentlemen. Your entire life is probably hanging on this. Your eternity is hanging on this. If I was at an academic conference, I'm a historian at one of the local universities here in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. If I was at a conference talking about this, I would say, we're going to explore today, ladies and gentlemen, the historicity of Jesus. I want you to say that word after me, historicity. Historicity. That word is really asking this simple question. Did Jesus really exist in history? It's important, folks. How do we answer this type of question? Well, you know, this idea of whether Jesus is really the Messiah or a myth has become a kind of a fashionable question to ask in some circles. In other words, Jesus perhaps was not a real person who walked the earth 2,000 years ago. Not so long ago, I was in a classroom setting where I was talking about Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Does anyone remember this blockbuster of a book that came out in the 2000s and then was turned into a film starring Tom Hanks, no less? And in amongst the story were all these historical people from the past, Constantine, Mary Magdalene, and none other than Jesus himself. So as I was talking about the kind of ridiculous claims that were being made in the Da Vinci Code, which had no basis in historical fact, one of the students put their hands up and asked this question. Well, Adam, is any of this relevant if Jesus actually did not exist as a real person in history? I thought, wow, interesting question. I've got a thinking student. I love this sort of stuff. And then a few years later, a major British paper, The Guardian, came out with an article, as you can see on the screen behind us here, which was asking, did Jesus exist? And the subheading on this was, today some claim that Jesus is just an idea rather than a real historical figure. And that same Guardian reported in a survey that it had undertaken that some 40% of people who responded to the survey did not believe that Jesus was a historical person, a real person in history. So today's kind of an apologetic message I'm giving today is a defense for the existence of Jesus in history. Now, you should not be worried. Well, you could be worried because it displays a kind of astounding amount of ignorance or lack of knowledge to respond to this kind of question by saying Jesus didn't exist, but it shouldn't actually surprise us. Where do these ideas from my student, from these recipients or these respondents to the survey, where do they get their ideas from? I think there are two kind of principal causes for this. The first is that the sidelining of what I teach and my colleagues teach in the humanities is not really exalted in our education system and given the prominence it should have. In other words, people are incredibly ignorant of history and things like geography. So we shouldn't be surprised when they give us answers that have no basis in historical fact. For example, another survey that was undertaken in the United Kingdom, they did a kind of geography survey, and they found that over half the people who responded to the survey thought that Mount Everest was the tallest mountain in the United Kingdom. Now, I think you know that is, I hope you know that's not the case. If you didn't know that, just laugh along with everybody else, how ridiculous that is. Because we know it's in the Himalayas or the Himalaya. In fact, the tallest, we could call it a mountain, couldn't we? If you're English here or Scottish, hopefully I'm not insulting you, you'd call it a mountain, but I think I could send my 10-year-old grandson with a packed lunch and a pair of sandals to climb up Ben Nevis. It's very different to Mount Everest, ladies and gentlemen. I wouldn't recommend that, by the way. Some people take what people say from the front too seriously. I wouldn't send my 10-year-old grandson up there to do that by himself. I would walk up with him as well. But it's nothing like Mount Everest, much more difficult. But you've got over half of Britons thinking this. Now, it's not just America, it's not just the British, but also Americans and people in Western society. They did a survey of the creme de la creme of American students at places like Stanford and Columbia and Harvard. And they gave them a map of the world, and they asked them, using this map, could they locate the United Kingdom? 60% of these students, who were future leaders of the world, couldn't find the United Kingdom. 30% of them couldn't find the Pacific Ocean. And 10% of these beautiful students could not find their own country. Now, you're laughing, but what would happen if you exited church today and you were given a map of the world? I wonder how well you and I would do. I kind of feel it's a universal problem. So it's not surprising that people fall for all kinds of extravagant claims that may in fact be wrong, simply because their own education in all of this is incredibly weak. The second reason for this, though, and it's a slightly more worrying trend, there's maybe a general malaise and ignorance, is the idea that Jesus is a fictional character is actually being encouraged by a small but vocal chorus of people called mythicists. These are people who populate corners of YouTube and other places on the internet. Now, mythicists believe that Jesus is a myth because although there are plenty of stories told about him, they would argue that they're not historical. His life and teaching were invented by early storytellers drawing on ancient pagan narratives about gods such as Adonis, Osiris, Mithras, or Bacchus. The problem with this theory is that it is at complete variance and against what the historians themselves who work in this area believe. I want to quote from one of these, an atheistic historian who works in the first century period. This is what he had to say. He said, "I should say at the outset that none of the mythicist literature is written by scholars trained in New Testament or early Christian studies, teaching at the major or even minor accredited theological seminaries, divinity schools, universities, or colleges of North America or Europe or elsewhere in the world. Of the thousands of scholars of early Christianity who teach at such schools, none of them, to my knowledge, has any doubt that Jesus existed." In other words, of the thousands of scholars working in this area, they all almost universally believe that Jesus was a real person in history. And why do they do that? What is it about the historians that lead them to this type of conclusion? Well, the answer to this, we need to go to real estate. If you were to ask your local real estate agent and you're thinking about buying a house, what should you consider first? They will often say location, location, location. And if you ask a historian, how can you know whether an event actually occurred in the past or somebody lived in the past? The historian is going to say to you, evidence, evidence, evidence. You see, the work that I do and tens of thousands of other historians around the world do, is analogous or similar to that of a lawyer in a court case. The lawyer presents evidence and cross-examines evidence. And the stronger the evidence, the stronger the case. Therefore, why do nearly all historians working in this area, whether they are Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, agnostic, or atheistic, believe that Jesus existed as a real person? It's because there is a greater weight of evidence for his existence than there is for the arguments against his existence. So what is this evidence? See, historians, in fact, have very early and substantial sources about Jesus to within 100 years of his life. And we're going to examine this in the time that we have left this morning. We're going to explore a range of sources that convince historians that Jesus is a real person that walked the earth 2,000 years ago. Most people are surprised by the idea that this book here that I have in my hand and the second part of it, the New Testament, is in fact a set of legitimate historical sources for historians. For the general public, when they think about the Holy Bible that the Christians bring to church on a Sunday that they spend their devotional time on, they assume that it's a sacred text. It has little bearing on history, and it is something that they use for their own spiritual enlightenment and for the kind of moral conduct and teaching for their own lives. But for a historian, when they look at the 27 books of the New Testament, the Gospels, the book of Acts, the letters, and of course the book of Revelation at the end, which we started with this morning, historians see this as a collection of historical primary sources, because they were written in, almost all of them, first century. There's some dispute over some of the letters, but in general sense, they were within this 100-year period. And so this means that historians see them as being able to shed light on the past, including the social, economic, political, military, and religious world in which they were written. In other words, they are a window into the first century. They are historical sources. We're going to look at this with a timeline. So a timeline's going to appear up on the screen, and we're going to enter in here, first on the timeline, Jesus of Nazareth. His life runs roughly from around 6 BC to AD 30, perhaps 32, perhaps 33, but for our purposes, we're going to say 6 BC to AD 30. And if we enter in here, our first set of sources that historians have from the past, we're going to see the Gospels up and behind me. We're going to see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in a somewhat different order than they appear in your New Testament. So scholarship kind of suggests to us that the first gospel that was actually written chronologically on our timeline is Mark's gospel. And you can see the dates that are kind of proposed for it. It's a range of dates. We don't know with any absolute certainty the exact year that the author of Mark's gospel wrote his gospel, but it falls within this general time frame. And then you'll see that John's gospel is in fact the last gospel that was written. Now the key thing to note about all this is not only is this an amazing set of sources, given the fact that Jesus was an itinerant, apocalyptic preacher. He's not an emperor. He's not a person of great political fame or great wealth. The fact we have these documents is remarkable in itself and speaks volumes to who Jesus was and what he did and his impact on people's lives, that we could have these kind of sources available. But look at the dates. It means that they were written in a range from 20 to 60 years after the event. Now, if we compare this with somebody like Muhammad, we know that the kind of first biography of Muhammad is some 125 years after he died. Or if you think about Alexander the Great, it's over 200 years we get the first kind of biography. So these Gospels are incredibly close, and this is significant to me as a historian. Why? Because one of the best sources you can have when you're writing a biography, ladies and gentlemen, are eyewitnesses you can interview, or you yourself could be an eyewitness and write one of these Gospels. So this means that historians many historians believe that Mark's gospel, the earliest gospel, is written by the companion of Peter on many of his adventures as recorded in the book of Acts. And in fact, that Mark's gospel is based on the testimony, and we could say the interviews of Mark with Peter. And if you think about John's gospel, what's that based on? The Apostle John himself. And you're thinking, Adam, but it's right at the end of the century. Could he still be alive? Well, John, when he was at the Last Supper and he leans against Jesus, most people believe he's a teenager. This is the kind of scholarly consensus. So say he's about 15 years of age. This means by the time we get to the end of the first century, he's only 75. And you're saying, can people live that long in the first century? Yes, they can. We have plenty of examples of people living into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So yes, it's entirely conceivable and possible that John was very long-lived, and he wrote his gospel based on his own eyewitness experience of Jesus. And of course, in Luke's gospel, right at the beginning, Luke says that he's basing this gospel on what? Eyewitness accounts. So we have these early sources. The next thing we want to enter onto our timeline, if you brought yourself a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, and you've got that moleskin notebook with you, if you're particularly trendy, ladies and gentlemen, you might be drawing this on here. It's extremely helpful. But we add into our timeline, before the Gospels are the Pauline epistles, these letters written by Paul. And you know, when we look at the New Testament, we think, well, the Gospels are written first because they appear first, then Paul's letters. In actual fact, Paul's letters were written between 50 and mid-60. And so this is an early source of material. And of course, the Gospels and Paul's letters all portray Jesus as a real person in history. I don't think there's anybody that can read these documents and not go, hey, this is a real person that they believed really existed, and some of them actually met him in their own lifetime. But we have even earlier source material for our timeline. It recorded in the book of Acts, we have some speeches. If you think about kind of really days after Jesus' ascension in the early part of the book of Acts, we find the disciples in the upper room in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Tongues of fire fall. Peter goes out and preaches. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? He talks about a very real person that he knew personally himself. When was this speech delivered? It was delivered within, we could say, days of Jesus departing this earth. An incredible kind of story and early source. But I think there's one here that I find incredibly compelling. You see, in Paul's letters, we not only have what Paul thought about Jesus as a historical character, but in a few places we have some early Christian creeds. So long before people had the entire New Testament, which is quite considerably later, we have people in this oral society, a verbal, non-written society for many of them, creating creeds which encapsulate the fundamental beliefs that they have. And these were shared amongst Christians. And we have one of the earliest creedal statements in Christianity, and it appears, as you can see on the timeline. Look at this. Within 2 to 3 years of Jesus' life. This will knock your socks off if you even just spend a moment thinking about it. It comes from Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 15, and it is amazing. Look what he had to say here. Remember, this letter was written about 53. Our man Paul says, "For I delivered to you first of all that which was also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas and then the 12. Now this is not something that Paul made up. It was something he got from somewhere else. How do we know it's a creed? Let's highlight the first stanza of this creed. Notice how he states in here, "For I delivered to you first of all that which I received." He got this saying from somebody else much earlier. How do we know it's a creed? because of its formulaic structure. Let's look at our next slide and highlight the things that link all these ideas together. You'll note in here that it talks about that Christ died, that he was buried, that he rose, that he was seen. And this is a key sign that it's a creed, because creeds are designed for easy memorization, which means they repeat certain phrases upon which everything else hangs. And so you could easily memorize this and share it with other people. The most astounding thing about all this is that scholars almost universally agree that it was written within a couple of years of Jesus' death and resurrection. Way too close for any myth-making to be possible. Can you see that? Clearly this is a creed about a real person, a person who died, a person who was buried and then rose the third day. All of this is all nice historical material. So we've just touched on the kind of 27 historical documents found in the New Testament that you bring to church with you every Sunday, whether in hard copy or in digital form. But there is more. Sounds like one of those infomercials, doesn't it? Free set of steak knives if you phone in now. There is more, ladies and gentlemen. You know, in the first century, there were other Christians who were alive who were also writing, and their writings did not make it into the New Testament. I want to put in our timeline here as we move away from the New Testament works. We're going to look at Clement of Rome. You say, Adam, is that Clement? I got a bit tired of looking at Renaissance paintings and stealing the images and putting them on my timeline. So I thought, you know what, this guy from ZZ Top, I reckon Clement looked like this guy. You know, he's in the Eastern Mediterranean. I bet he had a bandana, a hat, and some just bad glasses on. You know what I mean? Sunglasses in the first century would be so cool. So this is our man Clement. He's a Christian. He's in the first century. And the thing about him is, he's writing to the church at Corinth, telling them to avoid jealousy, Corinth had a lot of problems because Paul already wrote 2 letters to them, and our man's writing at the end here. He quotes extensively from the Old Testament in this work written in the 90s, and then he also references Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and then he makes all these statements about Jesus as a real person in history. He says that Jesus' sufferings were before our eyes. In other words, they were based on eyewitness testimony. He states that Jesus taught gentleness and patience. He says that Jesus came from Jacob, who I believe you've been studying recently, according to the flesh, and that Jesus' blood was poured out for our salvation. In other words, talking about the fact that he was born of a woman, therefore a real person in history, that he was executed on this cruel cross, another event in history. There's no doubt in Clement's mind in the first century that Jesus was a real person. But we have even more. Do you know, if we discount what we have from the New Testament and we discount people like Clement or Ignatius of Antioch, we have some non-Christian sources that I want to enter into our timeline. The real problem, I think, for many mythicists is not only this kind of Christian sources, but the non-Christian sources that tie up with the Christian ones in the most important aspects of Jesus' life. And we're going to look at 3 of them you can see up here. And they all fall within that 100-year period after Jesus' ministry ends, so 30 to 130. We're going to look in here at Josephus, Pliny, and Tacitus. Who would have thought, ladies and gentlemen? After today's service, people will ask where you were, what were you doing, and you'll say, I was in a church service listening to someone talk about Tacitus and Pliny, and they'll be going, what kind of church is that? It's the best sort, ladies and gentlemen. You know that for a truth. You know, we want to turn to our first one here, and it's Josephus. You know, he's writing about a Jewish historian from the first century, and he makes 2 references to Jesus, one in his Jewish antiquities, one which is very controversial. So we're not going to look at that. We're going to look at this small text which almost enters Jesus in as an incidental figure, an offhand comment, because he's going to be talking more importantly about James, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. But because the reader of his history might not know who James is, our man Josephus is going to tie him into a much more important person that everybody at the end of the first century in the Roman world would know who he was. I think you know who it is. It's James's brother, which of course was Jesus. Let's have a look at this text up here. Well, our man Aeneas, the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. Now, this small incidental fragment in this text is really revealing. Firstly, I think we can see that our man Josephus, as a Jewish believer who's become a Roman citizen, does not believe that Jesus is the Messiah or is the Christ. But he puts in here that some people obviously called him to the Christ, and that's what his readership would know, though he does not believe it. And I think this adds veracity to what he is saying. If we turn to Pliny the Younger, writing at around 112, he's writing to the emperor of the entire Roman Empire, and he makes a reference to Christ and his fellows. Listen to what he has to say. Therefore, these Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it. After which it was their custom to separate, then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Little side note here. Why is he assuring the emperor that the food that they are eating is innocent? Because there was this rumor that was widespread in the Roman Empire that Christians were cannibals, based around when Christians talked about the Last Supper, the flesh of Christ and Jesus' blood. And so this misunderstanding, you can see how these rumors start, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just in the 21st century on TikTok. In the first century, these Romans had all these crazy ideas about the Christians, and one of them was this idea of eating flesh and drinking blood. They didn't really understand it. But the key thing I think we want to see in here is that our man, Pliny, he's not speaking having read the 27 books of the New Testament. He's speaking from what the Roman world believed about Jesus and about Christians at that time. And it's clear that they believed that Jesus was what? A real person in history. And this brings us to our last text in here from our man Tacitus. It's 20 years after Josephus, 117 AD. He's a Roman historian whose book covered the Roman history from Tiberius to Nero. It's the sweet spot of Jesus' ministry and Paul's. Paul probably lost his life at the hands of Nero. And our man Tacitus, in his history, gets up to the Great Fire of Rome. I don't know if you know this, but in 64, a good portion of Rome was burnt down because our man Nero wanted, ladies and gentlemen, to build more Ryman retirement villages and a new Westfield Mall in Rome. So he actually had some of it burnt down. Now the problem was the people who lost their houses were upset at Nero. I don't know why. And so he came under a lot of heat. So he did what every good male has done since Adam and Eve. He decided that he would deflect blame. And he chose a group of people who were generally despised anyway. I hate to say it, ladies and gentlemen, it was Christians. This is what Tacitus has to say. He said, consequently, to get rid of the accusation and report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Now look at the historical information in this text. Christus, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procreators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part find their center and become popular. Sounds like they're talking about Hamilton, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, come on. Come on, parochialism is still strong, isn't it? So we can see in here. But I think the thing that's really interesting about this is, of course, Christians, it talks about where they got their name from. It says that he's a historical person, that he died a painful death, that it occurred during the reign of Tiberius, which is historically accurate, that it was at the hands of Pontius Pilate. That's what we know from the Gospels themselves. Christianity started in Jerusalem. That's what the New Testament documents tell us. And it had spread to Rome by the stage, which we also know from the book of Acts. And clearly, Jesus is a historical figure. Let's put our entire timeline up here as we draw to a close, ladies and gentlemen. Look at all of this evidence we have explored in the short time that we covered. Yes, get your phones out and take a photograph of it right now while I'm still talking. You only have a few minutes. I'm like a radio announcer trying to cover in the time before the news. Well, you can see in here, it's pretty incredible that all of these sources, without fail, ladies and gentlemen, from our 100 years after the life and ministry of Jesus, what do they say? They present Jesus as a real person in history. Now, we're going to finish with a short quote. And this quote comes from somebody who used to be an Episcopalian Christian, used to be a believer. He gave up his faith and he became an atheist, agnostic atheist. And normally we wouldn't quote this gentleman in church. Why? Because I generally disagree with many things he has to say. So does JD, so does Mel. But he's a historian of the first century. And when people come to him and they say to him, hey, did Jesus exist as a real person in history? This is what this atheistic, agnostic scholar has to say on the subject. And this is what he says. He says, I am not a Christian. I have no interest in promoting a Christian cause or a Christian agenda. But as an historian, I think evidence matters and the past matters. And for anyone to whom both evidence and the past matter, a dispassionate consideration of the case makes it quite plain. Jesus did exist. And what does that mean for you and I, ladies and gentlemen? Christmas is back on the menus, boys and girls. Good news. You know, the thing about all of this is that if Jesus was to appear to us today as he appeared to John on the Isle of Patmos at the end of the first century, perhaps he would tell us again that he was the first and the last. I am he that lives and was dead, and behold, I live forevermore. Jesus is not just a person in history. He certainly is. But he is, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, he is the Son of the living God. And he is worthy of our worship and our adoration this morning. And everybody said, Amen.